Hey everybody, we're back. In this module, we're going to be covering surprise and fear, contempt, and disgust. These correspond to two chapters in the Ekman book, which he calls surprise and fear, and then the other one he reverses the order of the two and goes with disgust and contempt. So I thought I'd be a little creative and flip those last two, so it would seem like I was not completely just going along with him. so um, let's go ahead and get started with why are we discussing surprise and fear together? I mean, they are clearly separate emotions. They are on that list that everybody included. All three theorists included surprise and fear as separate things. And so, why are we talking about them together? Well, like all emotions, they both activate the sympathetic nervous system. So that's not a good argument for doing them together, because if that was the only criterion, we'd discuss all of them together. So that can't be the only thing. One thing that they do that's different than the other emotions is that they can both cause syncope. There's different ways to pronounce syncope. So I apologize if it's not the way that you're used to hearing it. Syncope means to have a temporary loss of consciousness. Usually it's due to an insufficient blood flow to the brain. You might call it fainting, you might call it passing out. It most often comes when the blood pressure is too low. It's called hypotension as opposed to hypertension that we're usually more concerned about. And so the heart isn't pumping enough oxygen to the brain. And so a lot of times when a person faints, we put their feet up in the air and things like that to try and help get more blood to the brain, carrying its oxygen that'll allow the person to wake back up. So both surprise and fear can trigger syncope. So I thought I'd share with you that. Let me make sure this doesn't auto start. Okay, good. Yeah, so I had to record it because for some reason this one was marked as for mature audiences, and so you can only watch it on YouTube. I'm like, now when you see this video, you're going to say, why was that marked like that? So let me turn on the microphone so you can hear the actual soundtrack, and then I'll start the video. All right, so clearly when they all yelled surprise, it triggered syncope, and she passed out cold, just completely startled. And it was a surprise. It wasn't fear, right? Like she knew she had a blindfold on. She knew she was being led into something. So she probably had some guess that, and she probably knew it was her birthday or it was close to. So this is clearly surprise, not like true fear. It's more of a surprise. On America's Funniest Home Videos, they've had, a series of these where people walk into their own house. There's a surprise party there for them. And then they like fall out their own front door because they were, surprised by everybody's jumping up and yelling surprise. So surprise can trigger syncope, and then also fear can. So there's a bunch of these videos on YouTube also, where you can find these kinds where the person is on like a slingshot. This one you don't have to hear the sound. I'll just go ahead and let the video run because it's classic.
You're lying. Stop, no, stop.
I love the part where he wakes up, yells, "Mom, I love you," and immediately passes out again. He clearly is scared. He thinks he's going to die or something, right? So he's like, "Mom, I love you," and then passes out again. And then he's surprised that he kept passing out, right? He's like, "Wait, where are we? Did I pass out?" fear can cause that drop in blood pressure. And you could argue that the ride probably pushes a lot of blood out of your head, but of course his partner didn't pass out, did she? So I'm gonna argue against the interpretation that it was strictly the mechanics of the ride and say that it was fear based that triggered that fear to cause syncope in that rider. And it's really a frequent event because you see these videos all the time. I think it's probably like this entire row down here is people passing out from fear. Like it happens a lot. So that's something that the two share in common is this tendency to cause syncope. Another reason why we discuss surprise and fear, and I think some of you might have encountered this when you did the experiment where you were supposed to just show facial expressions and see if your friend, roommate, coworker, whoever you found could recognize. No, you guys did vocal expressions. It wasn't facial expressions. You guys did vocal expressions, and some of you reported that the thing that your friend had the most difficulty with was surprise and fear. And I was kind of thinking about how vocalization wise, both surprise and fear might have a gasp associated with it. And it's really a matter of like what the context is that will help you to decide whether that gasp is, a surprised gasp or a scared gasp. They both share the same brow raise as far as facial expressions go and are really only distinguishable by the mouth movement. This is a picture from a study from 2014 where they, used infrared cameras and we're able to track which part of the muscles were actually being activated during the facial expressions. And you see on the left surprise and on the right fear. And if you only look at the upper part of the face, it looks very similar. I mean, there's probably, if you were really microscopically analyzing, you might be able to see slightly different activation under the eyes. But boy, at first glance, it sure looks like the same expression around the eyes. And where the big difference is in the mouth on the surprise, where it's dropped open. I mean, that colon, I usually use a 0 as my emoticon for surprise. That colon 0 is really well represented by what our faces do, right? Our faces really do go colon, colon 0 to show surprise. Whereas the fear, now, I thought it was kind of interesting that in the fear depiction that they got in this study using these, you know, cameras that can actually detect the heat that's coming from the muscles being activated, you'll notice that the fear doesn't have the pulled back corners of the mouth that Ekman talks a lot about as being a key factor in fear. And so one of the things that these researchers said is that it, in an expression of surprise or fear, it takes to time period 3, which in their study was about, it was more than a second, but less than 3 seconds. I can't remember exactly what the measurement was, but it takes in that range for somebody to be able to detect whether this was a surprise expression or a fear expression. And so perhaps the picture that we're seeing on the right of fear is prior to that, the corners of the mouth being pulled back. Because Ekman really talks about that in the book, about how important the corners of the mouth pulling back are for distinguishing fear. So, I mean, the fact that they look really so similar, it makes a lot of sense that, we would talk about them together, because clearly there's, like Ekman talks about how our, you know, our interpretation of the situation or whatever is going to trigger facial muscle contractions in a particular way. And the fact that these two facial expressions look so similar and the sounds that we utter when surprised or fearful sound so similar might be evidence that they start very similar and then it takes some time for them to diverge and us to be able to distinguish surprise from fear. So let's check out this very animated face on this girl as she experiences a surprise. And they've got a nice freeze frame that looks like a good surprise face. But let's watch as she goes through the opening of this gift and the transition from surprise to something else.
There's just a little tape on it.
So she goes from, I think honestly, she felt the person in the box move and thought maybe she was getting a dog or something because she kind of had that sort of knowing anticipation face, but then it wasn't a dog at all when it started to move. So she had that confused face and a little bit of fear on her face there for a second as she was trying to figure out what actually was in the box. And then when she recognized that it was clearly a person who's been gone and was surprising her on return, the face went from kind of not sure to pure surprise to then pure joy, right? So, the thing about the facial expressions is you have to be aware of what's going on in the context, or else you have to have those really exaggerated facial expressions that we've been seeing, in the Ekman book or across these different videos that I've been showing you, really dramatic overacted versions of the expressions. Okay, you might be able to really clearly tell fear from surprise when the person's like pulling all the key muscles to distinguish those two expressions. But in real life, surprise and fear can be kind of intertwined. Like when you're getting surprised, it can go different ways, right? So um, we know that surprise is a very brief emotion. It's that it's that moment of maybe not being sure of what's going on. That would be a good way of describing what surprise is. Like something unexpected is happening and I'm not exactly sure whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, right? It quickly then transitions from surprise to something else, some other emotion. And really commonly, it's going to go from surprise to relief, or surprise to fear, or surprise to joy. Like if you had a moment of surprise and you weren't sure what it was, and you're like, oh, thank goodness it's something benign, that's probably going to produce relief. If it's something surprising, and then as you assess it, you realize that it's something that's a threat, it's going to transition very quickly into fear. If it's surprise and then you assess the situation and realize that it's something that you want to have happen, then it's going to transition quickly into joy. So I think that's one of the key things about surprise is that temporariness of it, that it's really that initial evidence that you were not expecting something and you're not sure how it's going to go. Like that would be a good way to describe what surprise is. So I thought it would be fun to talk about. See, I think there are two camps of people in the world. There are those people who think surprises are pleasant and people who think surprises are unpleasant. In our discussion of emotions, there's sort of two categories. Are these emotions pleasant? Are these emotions unpleasant? Right? Like we could argue that like happiness is a pleasant emotion and, you know, sadness is an unpleasant emotion. Like some of them are kind of easy to categorize. Surprise is one that it's like, is it pleasant? Is it something that we like? So I found a very questionable poll. So take all of this with a grain of salt. That was conducted by a firm called One Poll on behalf of an ice cream company. I think it was called Bubbles Ice Cream or something. I think it's out of business now. Thanks, pandemic, I think. So what they found in this poll was that those people who like surprises, self-reported that they like surprises, are more likely to be, oh, and here's where the report on the study was. It was a survey of 2,000 American adults. So that should give us a little bit more confidence, but I'm not entirely, I looked at other polls that this polling agency does, and I'm not completely confident that their sampling techniques are producing good, reliable data. But let's just go with this. And it's hard to find good research on surprise. I have to tell you, I searched and searched. It's really hard. So people who like surprises are more likely to be extroverted. And I really liked that they had actually administered the Big Five inventory as part of this poll. So I thought that was good. They tend to identify themselves as adventurous people. They tend to identify themselves as being spontaneous people. They are people who reported that they had gotten surprised by a vacation this past summer. The poll was conducted at the end of summer. They reported that they like to dance more often than people who don't like surprises, and they enjoy watching horror movies. People who don't enjoy surprises tended to score on the introverted end of the scale. They tended to identify themselves as sarcastic and anxious. They said if they were going to get surprised with a treat, their preferred surprise would be to get to have an afternoon by themselves this summer. They reported that when they attended social events, they tended to prefer those that had 5 or fewer attendees, and they would much rather read a book in the shade than watch a horror movie. So even though I'm not entirely, confident with this polling place, a lot of what's listed here makes sense, doesn't it? That if you're the sort of person who likes surprises, you're probably like, yeah, I do like those things. And if you're the kind of person who doesn't like surprises, you're probably like, yep, that sounds like me. Um, so it's possible that there are just sort of like personality traits that help to decide whether you think that a surprise is a pleasant experience or an unpleasant experience. And if you think back in your life, I mean, back to childhood, about times that you were surprised by something, like, and I'm gonna talk about like um surprises where somebody planned something and you didn't know about it, and the point of the planning was to surprise you with it, right? Like to, you'd find out about it after all the work and planning had been done. If you think back to your childhood experiences with something like that, probably the way that you felt about it when you were little is consistent with how you feel about it today. That it's probably sort of how you are. I know I am. I know for me, I mean, the first time that I can really remember my parents attempting to surprise me with something was a party for my 11th or 12th birthday. I'm not sure which one. And my mom had like set it up so that all my friends would be at my house after school on a weekday, and one of my other friends sort of held me up at school so I wouldn't go directly back. And so we walked over to my house. I had invited that friend. My mom said, "Hey, why don't you invite so and so to come over on, your actual birthday on a weekday?" I'm like, "Okay, I'll do that." And then we kind of hung around school for a little bit. We walked over to my house together, and then all the other people who are I would consider friends at that time were all there. And my mom was really excited and thought this was going to be super fun to surprise me. And I just burst into tears. I was so upset. And of course, when you're that ungrateful about a surprise, everybody sort of doesn't think you've handled it very well, right? Your emotional regulation is weak. But it really, that's how I always feel about surprises. Like it makes me want to burst into tears. Like I don't enjoy it. I'm laughing because it's ridiculous, but I mean, anybody else who's listening, hopefully you're like, good, I'm not alone, right? Because it's you feel like you're a bad sport or a bad person if you don't enjoy surprises. The last thing I wanted to say about this survey is that 52% of people say that a small gesture is the best kind of surprise that they could experience, um, which I would characterize having my friends over after school on a weekday is probably a smaller gesture, so I probably should have liked it. 59% say that some of their best summer memories are made up of small, surprising moments where, like, they didn't expect to bump into a friend at the park, or that, their housemate came home with, ice cream in a quart, and they got to sit together and eat the ice cream, and you weren't expecting it, but here it is, and I got to have this small, surprising moment, or the clouds cleared in time to see the sunset or something like that. Like that's what most people say is, a pleasant surprise. Something small, something that, doesn't make it feel like you didn't know something was happening, or those kinds of, like, these small surprising moments are the ones that people tend to enjoy and call pleasant. All right, let's go ahead and take a break here since I was talking a little long, and we'll come back and talk about why surprises aren't always fun.